Evelyn Hart in her office, a serene space filled with soft lighting, bookshelves lined with psychology texts, and a large window overlooking a quiet city street. Evelyn is reviewing case files, her demeanor calm and professional. She is a woman in her late 30s, known for her expertise in treating severe delusions and psychosis. Her reputation as a compassionate yet unshakable psychiatrist is well earned, but there's a subtle weariness in her eyes, a hint that she's seen too much and carries the weight of her patient's suffering. Evelyn is called to the hospital's secure wing to evaluate a new patient, Victor Crane. He was found wandering the streets in a catatonic state, his face frozen in a grotesque, unnatural grin. The staff describes him as disturbing and unresponsive, but Evelyn is intrigued. When she enters the room, Victor is seated, staring blankly at the wall. His grin is unnerving. It stretches too wide, revealing too many teeth, and his eyes are hollow, as if whatever made him human has been drained away. Evelyn introduces herself, but Victor doesn't react. She notices his hands are trembling slightly, and his lips move as if whispering something inaudible. Evelyn begins her session with Victor, speaking softly and trying to establish a connection. At first, he remains unresponsive, but then he suddenly leans forward, his grin widening unnaturally. His voice is a raspy whisper as he says, "The grin is contagious. You'll wear it too." Evelyn recoils, her professional composure faltering for the first time. Victor collapses back into his chair, his expression returning to its blank, catatonic state. The abrupt shift is jarring, leaving Evelyn shaken but determined to understand what's happening to him. As Evelyn leaves the session, she notices a hospital staff member standing in the hallway. The man is grinning, a wide, unnatural grin that mirrors Victor's. Evelyn freezes, her heart racing, but when she blinks, the grin is gone, and the staff member is smiling politely, asking if she needs anything. Evelyn brushes it off as stress, but the encounter lingers in her mind. She returns to her office, trying to focus on her work, but the image of the grinning staff member haunts her. The chapter ends with Evelyn at home, sitting in front of her bathroom mirror. She stares at her reflection, half expecting to see the grin on her own face. The room is silent except for the faint sound of whispers, though she can't tell if they're real or in her head. She tries to rationalize the day's events, telling herself that Victor's condition is just another case, albeit an unusual one. But deep down, she feels a growing unease, a sense that something is deeply wrong. Evelyn Hart in her home, sitting at her desk late at night. The room is dimly lit, the only sound the ticking of a clock. She's reviewing Victor Crane's case notes, trying to make sense of his cryptic warning. The grin is contagious. As she flips through the pages, she notices her hands trembling slightly. She brushes it off as fatigue, but the unease from her encounter with Victor lingers. Suddenly, she sees movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. She turns, but no one is there. Her heart races as she tries to rationalize it as a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched doesn't go away. Over the next few days, Evelyn begins to notice more unsettling phenomena. She catches fleeting glimpses of the Rictus grin in mirrors and reflective surfaces, on the subway, in her office window, even in the polished surface of her coffee mug. Each time, the grin disappears when she looks again, leaving her questioning her sanity. At work, she feels increasingly isolated. Her colleagues seem distant, and she notices one of them grinning at her in the hallway, a grin that's too wide, too unnatural. When she blinks, the grin is gone, and the colleague acts normally. Evelyn tries to convince herself it's stress, but the encounters leave her deeply unsettled. Victor's sessions grow increasingly disturbing. He begins to speak more, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He describes a shadow world that exists just beneath the surface of reality, a place where the rules of sanity don't apply. The grin is a symbol, Victor says, his hollow eyes fixed on Evelyn. It's a sign of surrender. When you see it, it means the shadow world has claimed you. Evelyn tries to maintain her professional composure, but Victor's words unsettle her. She asks him how to resist the shadow world, but he only smiles, a grotesque, unnatural smile, and says, "You can't. It's already inside you." Determined to understand Victor's condition, Evelyn begins to investigate his background. She discovers that his previous psychiatrist, Dr. Langford, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There are no leads, and the case has gone cold. Evelyn finds a photograph of Dr. Langford in Victor's file. In the photo, Langford is smiling, but there's something off about his expression, something that reminds Evelyn of Victor's grin. She feels a chill run down her spine as she realizes that Langford's disappearance might be connected to Victor's condition. One night, Evelyn wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. She goes to the bathroom and looks in the mirror. Her reflection is grinning at her, though she isn't smiling. The reflection's grin is wide and unnatural, just like Victor's. Evelyn stares in horror as her reflection mouths the words, "Join us!" She stumbles back, and when she looks again, her reflection is normal. But the experience leaves her shaken, and she can't shake the feeling that something is very wrong. The next day, Evelyn receives a package at her office. Inside is Dr. Langford's old journal, along with a note that reads, "You're next." The journal is filled with notes about Victor and the shadow world, as well as Langford's own descent into madness. Evelyn is both terrified and intrigued. She begins to read the journal, and the more she reads, the more she realizes that Langford's experiences mirror her own. The journal ends abruptly with a final entry that reads, "The shadow world is real. It's coming for me. It's coming for you." As Evelyn continues to read the journal, she begins to hear whispers in her empty home. At first they're faint, but they grow louder and more insistent. She can't make out what they're saying, but they seem to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Evelyn tries to rationalize the whispers as her imagination, but they're too real to ignore. She begins to question her own sanity, wondering if she's losing her grip on reality. Evelyn Hart in her office, surrounded by stacks of files and notes. She's determined to uncover the truth about Victor Crane and the shadow world he described. Her desk is cluttered with police reports, medical records, and newspaper clippings, all related to Victor and his mysterious past. Evelyn's exhaustion is evident, dark circles under her eyes, her hair disheveled, her hands trembling slightly as she flips through the pages. She's been working late into the night, driven by a mix of professional curiosity and personal fear. The more she learns, the more she realizes that Victor's case is far from ordinary. Evelyn's research reveals a disturbing pattern. Everyone connected to Victor has either vanished or gone mad. She finds records of Victor's previous therapists, all of whom disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She also discovers that several of Victor's acquaintances were found dead, their faces frozen in the same grotesque grin. Dr. Langford, Victor's last psychiatrist, who vanished without a trace. Evelyn finds a photograph of Langford in one of the files, a group photo from a psychiatric conference. Langford is smiling, but his grin is unnaturally wide, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Evelyn feels a chill run down her spine as she realizes that Langford's disappearance might be connected to Victor's condition. As Evelyn continues her investigation, she begins to see the rictus grin on strangers' faces in public. She's walking down the street when she notices a man on the corner grinning at her. A wide, unnatural grin that mirrors Victor's. She freezes, her heart racing. But when she blinks, the grin is gone, and the man is smiling politely. Later, she's in a cafe, sipping coffee and reviewing her notes, when she catches a glimpse of the grin in the reflection of the window. She turns, but no one is there. The encounters leave her deeply unsettled, and she begins to question her own sanity. During her next session with Victor, Evelyn tries to confront him about her findings. She asks him about the shadow world and the people who have disappeared. Victor remains silent for a long time, his hollow eyes fixed on her. Then, without warning, he lunges forward, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. His voice is a raspy whisper as he says, "You're already one of us." Evelyn tries to pull away, but Victor's grip is like iron. She feels a wave of dizziness, and the room begins to spin. The last thing she sees before everything goes black is Victor's grotesque grin. She wakes up in her office, slumped over her desk. Her arm aches where Victor grabbed her, but there's no mark. She's not sure if the encounter was real or a hallucination, but the fear lingers. Evelyn returns home that evening, still shaken from her encounter with Victor. As she steps into her apartment, she's greeted by an eerie silence. Her cat, usually waiting by the door, is nowhere to be seen. She finds the cat in the living room, lying motionless on the floor. Its face is frozen in a grotesque grin, its eyes wide and lifeless. Evelyn feels a wave of nausea as she realizes that the rictus grin has claimed another victim. The next morning, Evelyn is woken by the sound of sirens. She looks out her window to see police cars and an ambulance parked outside her building. She goes downstairs to find a crowd gathered around the entrance. Her neighbor, an elderly man who had been acting strangely in recent days, is being carried out on a stretcher. His face is frozen in the same grotesque grin as the cat's. Evelyn feels a chill run down her spine as she realizes that the grin is spreading beyond her own life, claiming more victims. Evelyn's sitting in her apartment, staring at the wall. The events of the past few days weigh heavily on her, and she feels a growing sense of dread. She tries to rationalize what's happening, but the evidence is overwhelming. The Rictus grin is real, and it's spreading. She opens Dr. Langford's journal, flipping through the pages. The final entry catches her eye. The shadow world is real. It's coming for me. It's coming for you. Evelyn closes the journal, her hands trembling. She knows she can't ignore the truth any longer. The shadow world is real, and it's coming for her. Evelyn Hart arriving at the hospital early in the morning, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous days. She's determined to confront Victor Crane about the Rictus grin and the shadow world. But when she reaches his room, she finds it empty. The door is locked from the inside, and the window is sealed shut. There's no sign of forced entry or escape. Victor has simply vanished. On his bed lies a single sheet of paper with a cryptic message scrawled in shaky handwriting. The shadow world awaits. Evelyn feels a chill run down her spine as she realizes that Victor's disappearance is not just a mystery, it's a warning. Evelyn reaches out to Detective Marcus Hale, a no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for solving bizarre cases. Hale is skeptical at first, but Evelyn's evidence, Victor's cryptic note, the pattern of disappearances, and the Rictus grin convinces him to take the case seriously. Together, they begin to investigate Victor's past, digging through old records and interviewing people who knew him. They uncover a series of unsolved cases linked to the Rictus grin, missing persons, unexplained deaths, and reports of people behaving erratically before vanishing. Each case shares a common thread. The victims were all connected to Victor in some way. Evelyn and Hale discover that Victor was part of a secret psychiatric experiment conducted decades ago. The experiment, led by a doctor, Alistair Graves, aimed to cure insanity by merging patients' minds with a collective consciousness. The goal was to create a shared mental space where patients could support each other. But the experiment went horribly wrong. The patients began to experience shared delusions and hallucinations, and many of them vanished without a trace. The experiment was shut down, and all records were buried. Evelyn realizes that Victor's descriptions of the shadow world might be connected to this experiment, a shared mental space gone awry. This revelation adds a new layer of complexity to the story. The idea of a collective consciousness gone wrong ties Victor's condition to a larger, more sinister phenomenon, while the secret experiment provides a plausible explanation for the Rictus grin and the shadow world. As Evelyn and Hale continue their investigation, they visit an abandoned asylum where the experiment was conducted. The building is decrepit, its halls filled with the echoes of past horrors. They find a room filled with old equipment and patient records, including Victor's file. As they're examining the records, Hale suddenly begins to grin uncontrollably. His grin is wide and unnatural, his eyes wide with terror. He screams, "It's inside me! It's inside me!" before collapsing to the floor, dead. His face is frozen in the Rictus grin. Evelyn is horrified, her mind racing as she tries to process what just happened. She realizes that the shadow world is not just a delusion. It's a deadly force that can claim anyone connected to it. In the aftermath of Hale's death, Evelyn continues to search through the records. She finds a photograph in Victor's file that stops her cold. It's a picture of a younger version of herself, standing next to Victor and Dr. Graves. Evelyn has no memory of ever meeting Victor or being part of the experiment, but the photograph is undeniable. She feels a wave of dizziness as she tries to make sense of it, her mind struggling to reconcile the image with her memories. As Evelyn leaves the asylum, she begins to hear Victor's voice in her head. It's faint at first, a whisper in the back of her mind, but it grows louder and more insistent. "Join us," the voice says. "You're already one of us." Evelyn tries to ignore the voice, but it's relentless. She feels a growing sense of dread as she realizes that the shadow world is not just an external threat, it's inside her, pulling her closer with every passing moment. Evelyn's sitting in her apartment, staring at the photograph. Her mind is a whirlwind of questions and fears. She knows she can't ignore the truth any longer. The shadow world is real, and it's coming for her. She opens Dr. Langford's journal, flipping through the pages. The final entry catches her eye. The shadow world is real. It's coming for me. It's coming for you. Evelyn closes the journal, her hands trembling. She knows she has to confront the shadow world, but she's not sure if she's strong enough to survive it. Evelyn Hart in her apartment, the weight of the previous days pressing down on her. She's barely slept, her mind racing with questions about Victor, the shadow world, and the photograph of her younger self. The lines between reality and hallucination are beginning to blur. As she sits at her desk, the room around her seems to shift subtly. The walls ripple like water, the shadows deepen, and the air feels heavy and oppressive. She hears faint whispers, though no one is there. When she looks in the mirror, her reflection grins back at her, though she isn't smiling. She slams the mirror face down on the desk, her hands trembling. Evelyn's grip on reality weakens as she begins to experience vivid hallucinations of the shadow world. She's walking down the street when the world around her suddenly shifts. The sky turns a sickly green, the buildings twist and warp, and the people around her are replaced by grotesque, grinning figures. The figures whisper to her, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of madness. "Join us," they say. "You belong here." Evelyn tries to run, but the world around her shifts again, and she finds herself back in her apartment, unsure if the experience was real or a hallucination. Determined to find answers, Evelyn returns to the abandoned asylum where the secret experiment was conducted. As she explores the decaying building, she begins to hear a faint voice calling her name. She follows the voice to a locked room where she finds Dr. Langford, alive but barely recognizable. Langford's face is frozen in the Rictus grin, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He speaks in a raspy whisper, his voice barely audible. "The shadow world is real," he says. "It's a prison for the mind. Once you're here, there's no escape." Evelyn is horrified, but Langford's revelation confirms her worst fears. The shadow world is real, and it's a place of eternal torment. This twist adds a new layer of complexity to the story. Langford's survival and his transformation into a grinning, hollow figure reinforce the idea that the shadow world is a deadly force, while his warning raises the stakes for Evelyn. As Evelyn tries to process Langford's revelation, she's suddenly attacked by shadowy figures with grotesque, grinning faces. They emerge from the walls and floor, their movements jerky and unnatural. Evelyn tries to fight them off, but they're too strong. One of the figures scratches her arm, leaving a deep, bleeding wound. The pain is intense, but what's worse is the mark it leaves, a black vein-like pattern that begins to spread up her arm like an infection. Evelyn manages to escape, but the mark continues to spread, a physical manifestation of the shadow world's influence. Evelyn returns home, her arm throbbing with pain. As she tries to tend to the wound, her phone rings. The caller ID shows her own number. Hesitantly, she answers. On the other end, she hears her own voice, whispering, "You can't escape." The voice is faint but unmistakable, and it sends a chill down her spine. She drops the phone, her mind racing as she tries to make sense of what just happened. Evelyn is forced to confront the possibility that the shadow world is real and that Victor is trying to pull her into it. She sits in her apartment, the spreading mark on her arm, a constant reminder of the danger she's in. She opens Dr. Langford's journal, flipping through the pages. The final entry catches her eye. "The shadow world is real. It's coming for me. It's coming for you." Evelyn closes the journal, her hands trembling. She knows she has to confront the shadow world, but she's not sure if she's strong enough to survive it. Evelyn Hart in her apartment, the spreading black mark on her arm, a constant reminder of the shadow world's grip on her. She's surrounded by Dr. Langford's journal, Victor's files, and the photograph of her younger self. Desperation drives her to search for answers, and she finally uncovers an old leather-bound journal hidden in a box of Langford's belongings. The journal belongs to Dr. Alistair Graves, the lead scientist behind the secret psychiatric experiment. Its pages are filled with detailed notes on the shadow world, describing it as a collective unconsciousness where the minds of the insane are trapped. The final entry outlines a ritual to enter the shadow world and free those trapped there. Evelyn reads the instructions with a mix of hope and dread. The ritual requires specific items: a mirror, a black candle, and a personal sacrifice. The journal warns that the ritual is dangerous and could destroy the mind of anyone who attempts it. Evelyn debates whether to perform the ritual. On one hand, it might be her only chance to stop the shadow world and save herself. On the other hand, the risk of losing her mind is terrifying. She paces her apartment, her thoughts racing as she weighs the pros and cons. She thinks about Victor, Doctor, Langford, and Detective Hale, all victims of the shadow world. She thinks about the photograph of her younger self and the possibility that she might have been part of the experiment. The more she thinks, the more she realizes that she has no choice. The shadow world is already inside her, and the only way to fight it is to confront it head-on. As Evelyn prepares the ritual, she gathers the required items: a mirror, a black candle, and a knife for the personal sacrifice. She sets up the ritual in her living room, the mirror positioned to reflect the candle's flickering light. Just as she's about to begin, she feels a cold presence behind her. She turns to see the ghost of Detective Hale, his face frozen in the Rictus grin. His voice is a hollow whisper as he says, "Don't do it. The shadow world will consume you." Evelyn is terrified, but she knows she can't turn back. "I have to try," she says, her voice trembling. Hale's ghost fades away, leaving her alone with the mirror and the candle. The ritual requires a personal sacrifice, a physical and symbolic act of commitment. Evelyn must cut her palm and use her blood to complete the ritual. She hesitates, the knife trembling in her hand, but she knows there's no other way. She makes a shallow cut across her palm, wincing at the pain. Blood wells up, and she lets it drip onto the black candle, which sputters and flares with an unnatural light. The mirror begins to ripple like water, and the room around her seems to shift and warp. As the ritual progresses, Evelyn begins to feel an uncontrollable urge to smile. She looks in the mirror and sees the Rictus grin spreading across her face, though she isn't smiling. Her reflection's eyes are hollow and lifeless, and its grin is wide and unnatural. Evelyn tries to fight the urge, but it's too strong. She feels a wave of dizziness, and the room around her begins to spin. The whispers return, louder and more insistent than ever. "Join us," they say. "You belong here." Evelyn completes the ritual. The mirror's surface ripples like water, and the room around her dissolves into darkness. She feels a sudden, overwhelming sense of falling, as if she's being pulled into an endless void. When she opens her eyes, she's in the shadow world. The environment is a twisted, nightmarish version of her own life. The buildings are warped and distorted. The sky is a sickly green, and the air is thick with the sound of whispers. Evelyn knows there's no turning back. She's in the shadow world now, and the only way out is to confront the madness within. This climactic moment sets the stage for Evelyn's journey into the shadow world. The twisted, nightmarish environment creates a sense of dread, while the whispers reinforce the idea that Evelyn is being drawn deeper into the madness. Evelyn completes the ritual. The mirror's surface ripples like water, and the room around her dissolves into darkness. She feels a sudden, overwhelming sense of falling, as if she's being pulled into an endless void. When she opens her eyes, she's in the shadow world. The environment is a twisted, nightmarish version of her own life. The buildings are warped and distorted. The sky is a sickly green, and the air is thick with the sound of whispers. Evelyn knows there's no turning back. She's in the shadow world now, and the only way out is to confront the madness within. This climactic moment sets the stage for Evelyn's journey into the shadow world. The twisted, nightmarish environment creates a sense of dread, while the whispers reinforce the idea that Evelyn is being drawn deeper into the madness. Evelyn Hart standing in the shadow world, her senses overwhelmed by the surreal, ever-shifting landscape. The sky is a sickly green, the ground beneath her feet feels unstable, and the air is thick with the sound of whispers. The buildings around her are warped and distorted, their angles impossible, their surfaces pulsating as if alive. Evelyn takes a hesitant step forward, her heart racing. She knows she's no longer in the real world, but the shadow world feels more real than anything she's ever experienced. The whispers grow louder, overlapping in a cacophony of madness. "Join us," they say. "You belong here." As Evelyn navigates the shadow world, she encounters grotesque versions of her patients and loved ones. She sees a twisted version of Detective Hale, his face frozen in the Rictus grin, his body contorted and unnatural. He reaches out to her, his voice a hollow whisper. "You can't escape." She also sees her mother, but her face is distorted, her eyes hollow, and her grin too wide. "Why did you leave me?" her mother asks, her voice filled with accusation. Evelyn tries to run, but the shadow world shifts around her, trapping her in a maze of horrors. Evelyn stumbles upon a clearing in the shadow world, where she finds a group of figures huddled together. They're all grinning, their faces frozen in the Rictus grin, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They whisper to her, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of madness. "The shadow world is a manifestation of collective human insanity," one of them says. "The grin is a symbol of submission. When you smile, you surrender." Evelyn realizes that the shadow world is not just a place, it's a state of mind. It's where the minds of the insane are trapped, their sanity consumed by the collective madness. The Rictus grin is a sign of surrender, a symbol of submission to the shadow world. As Evelyn tries to process the revelation, she's suddenly attacked by Dr. Langford, who has become a monstrous, grinning entity. His body is twisted and unnatural, his face frozen in the Rictus grin, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "You can't escape," Langford says, his voice a hollow whisper. "The shadow world has claimed you." Evelyn tries to fight him off, but he's too strong. She manages to escape, but not before Langford scratches her arm, leaving a deep, bleeding wound. The pain is intense, but what's worse is the mark it leaves, a black vein-like pattern that begins to spread up her arm like an infection. Evelyn stumbles upon a mirror in the shadow world, its surface rippling like water. She looks into it and sees a version of herself who succumbed to the grin. Her reflection is smiling grotesquely, her eyes hollow and lifeless. "Join us," the reflection says, its voice a hollow whisper. "You belong here." Evelyn is horrified, but she can't look away. The reflection reaches out to her, its hand passing through the mirror's surface. Evelyn feels a wave of dizziness, and the room around her begins to spin. As Evelyn tries to escape the mirror, she's confronted by Victor. He's no longer the catatonic patient she knew. He's a confident, almost serene figure, his face free of the Rictus grin. "I brought you here to free you," Victor says. "The shadow world is not a prison, it's a liberation. The illusion of sanity is the real prison. Here, you can be free." Evelyn is stunned. She realizes that Victor's goal was never to trap her in the shadow world. It was to free her from the illusion of sanity. This twist adds a new layer of complexity to the story. Victor's revelation challenges Evelyn's understanding of sanity and madness, while his serene demeanor creates a sense of unease. Evelyn is forced to decide whether to succumb to the shadow world or fight to return to reality. She looks at the spreading mark on her arm, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. "Join us," they say. "You belong here." Evelyn knows she has to make a choice. She can surrender to the shadow world and embrace the madness, or she can fight to return to reality and risk losing her mind. Evelyn Hart standing in the shadow world, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The whispers are deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging her to surrender. The grotesque figures of her patients and loved ones surround her, their rictus grins wide and unnatural. Evelyn knows she has to make a choice, succumb to the shadow world and embrace the madness, or fight to return to reality and risk losing her mind. She takes a deep breath, her mind racing as she tries to find a way out. Evelyn confronts Victor, who stands at the center of the shadow world, his serene demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. "You can't escape," Victor says, his voice calm and reassuring. "The shadow world is your true home." Evelyn refuses to give in. She uses her knowledge of psychology to challenge Victor, questioning the nature of sanity and madness. "Sanity is just an illusion," she says, her voice trembling but determined. "But so is the shadow world. It's a construct of the mind, and I can deconstruct it." Victor's serene demeanor falters for a moment, his confidence shaken. Evelyn seizes the opportunity, focusing her mind and pushing back against the shadow world's influence. The environment around her begins to shift and warp, the grotesque figures dissolving into shadows. As Evelyn pushes back against the shadow world, she's confronted by a horde of grinning shadow figures. They emerge from the darkness, their faces frozen in the rictus grin, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Evelyn tries to fight them off, but they're too numerous. She's overwhelmed, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. "Join us," they say. "You belong here." Just as she's about to give in, Evelyn remembers Victor's words. The shadow world is a construct of the mind. She focuses her mind, visualizing the shadow world as a fragile illusion. The horde of grinning figures begins to dissolve, their forms breaking apart into shadows. Evelyn manages to escape, but not without severe psychological scars. The experience has left her deeply shaken, her mind teetering on the edge of sanity. Evelyn wakes up in her office, slumped over her desk. For a moment, she thinks it was all a dream, a vivid, terrifying nightmare. But as she looks around, she notices something strange. Everyone around her, her colleagues, her patients, even the people outside her window, bears the Rictus grin. Their smiles are wide and unnatural, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Evelyn feels a chill run down her spine as she realizes that the shadow world has followed her back to reality. She looks in the mirror and sees her own reflection grinning back at her, though she isn't smiling. The Rictus grin is etched on her face, a permanent reminder of her journey into the shadow world. Evelyn tries to return to her normal life, but the Rictus grin is a constant reminder of the shadow world. She sees it everywhere, on the faces of strangers, in the reflections of windows, even in her dreams. She tries to rationalize it as stress or a lingering effect of the shadow world, but deep down, she knows the truth. The shadow world is real, and it's inside her. The story ends with Evelyn sitting in her office, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The Rictus grin is etched on her face, but she isn't smiling. Or is she? She feels a strange sense of peace, as if the shadow world has finally set her free. She smiles. A genuine smile, or the Rictus grin. The line between sanity and insanity blurs, and the reader is left wondering whether Evelyn has truly escaped the shadow world or succumbed to its madness.